Imagine standing on a fault line where the tectonic plates of global diplomacy, domestic rebellion, and nuclear ambition meet. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined by this exact kind of volatility. But today, the ground beneath our feet feels more unstable than ever. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, once hailed as a historic diplomatic breakthrough, now resembles a ghost ship drifting in diplomatic waters. We hear the phrase Iran deal constantly in the news. But what does its current paralysis actually mean for the ordinary citizen in Tehran, or for the balance of power in the Middle East? Today, we are going to strip away the talking points and look at the hard intelligence. We want to understand if the dream of a democratic Iran is being crushed by the weight of international sanctions, or if the regime is quietly building a fortress that cannot be breached.
It is a fascinating and highly complex puzzle. To understand where we are today, we have to look at the sheer distance between the original intent of the 2015 agreement and the reality on the ground right now. Back then, the deal was built on a simple transaction. Iran limits its nuclear program, and the West lifts crippling economic sanctions. But when the U.S. walked away in 2018, that transaction collapsed. Today, Iran is enriching uranium to 60% purity, which is technically just a short step away from weapons-grade 90%. They are using advanced centrifuges that operate at speeds we did not even anticipate a decade ago. The diplomatic leverage the West once held has evaporated, and we are left with a situation where Iran is essentially a threshold nuclear state. They have the technology and the material. All they need is the political decision to cross the finish line.
That threshold status is terrifying to many, but it also raises a critical question about strategy. If the diplomatic path is stalled, what is the alternative? Sanctions were supposed to bring the regime to its knees, force them back to the negotiating table, or perhaps even spark a domestic uprising that would change the government entirely. Yet, the regime is still standing. Are we looking at a policy failure, or is there a deeper game being played here that we are missing?
It is definitely a policy paradox. The theory behind maximum pressure was that economic isolation would starve the regime of resources, and to some extent it did. The Iranian rial has plummeted, inflation is rampant, and the average Iranian struggles to buy basic goods. But here is the catch: sanctions are a blunt instrument. Instead of weakening the ruling elite, they often decimate the middle class, which is historically the engine of any democratic movement. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, actually thrives in a sanctioned economy because they control the black markets and the smuggling routes. They become the gatekeepers of the economy. So, while the population suffers, the regime's security apparatus grows more entrenched. They have adapted to the pressure, creating what they call a resistance economy, heavily supported by oil sales to countries like China that are willing to bypass Western financial systems.
So, in trying to weaken the regime, we might actually be weakening the very people who could change it from within. That brings us to the internal dynamics of Iran. Over the past couple of years, we saw the incredible courage of the woman, life, freedom movement. Millions of Iranians, led by young women, took to the streets demanding fundamental change. It felt like a tipping point, but the regime responded with brutal force. Where does that internal resistance stand now? Is the desire for democratization still alive, or has the crackdown successfully silenced the population?
The desire is absolutely alive, but the expression of that desire has changed. The street protests may have quieted down due to the sheer brutality of the state's response executions, mass arrests, and systemic violence, but the underlying grievances have not gone away. In fact, they have intensified. What we are seeing now is a quiet, persistent resistance. Women refusing to wear the mandatory hijab in public, labor strikes, and a general refusal to participate in the regime's political theater. The low voter turnout in recent elections is a clear indicator of a massive legitimacy crisis. The regime can control the streets with guns, but it cannot force the population to believe in its ideology anymore. The gap between the aging ruling clerics and a young, highly educated, internet-savvy population is a canyon that cannot be bridged. Democratization in Iran is not a question of if, but when and how.
Before we dive deeper into what that transition might look like and how it affects the wider region, let's take a quick moment. stay ahead of the noise. The new Sentinel cuts through the chaos to bring you fearless insights, unfiltered truth, and the stories that actually matter. Every episode delivers sharp analysis on the topic of the day, no spin, no agenda, just clarity. Join the movement right now. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. Like, comment, and view every show. And drop your own inquiry about today's topic, we read them all. Businesses want to reach a highly engaged audience that values real journalism? Advertise with the new Sentinel. Reach out today at claebd@yahoo.com. The new Sentinel. See clearly. Stay informed. Subscribe now.
Returning to the internal dynamics, it is crucial to realize that a transition to democracy in Iran won't look like a sudden, peaceful Western-style election. If the regime begins to fracture, we could see a highly volatile period. The IRGC has a massive stake in maintaining the status quo, both ideologically and financially. If they feel their survival is threatened, they won't hesitate to pull the region down with them.
That is the nightmare scenario for neighboring countries. If we look at the wider Middle East, Iran's influence is felt everywhere through its network of proxies in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. How does the current stalemate between the US and Iran shape these regional dynamics? We recently saw some diplomatic thawing, like the Saudi-Iran normalization brokered by China. Does that signal a shift towards stability, or is it just a tactical pause?
It is highly tactical. The Saudi-Iran détente was less about genuine friendship and more about risk management. Saudi Arabia wanted to secure its economic projects from drone attacks, and Iran wanted to ease its diplomatic isolation. But the structural rivalry remains. Iran's proxy strategy, which they call the axis of resistance, is their primary defense mechanism. Because their conventional military is outdated due to decades of embargoes, they rely on asymmetric warfare. They project power outward, so they don't have to fight wars on their own soil. Any change in Tehran, whether it is a hardline escalation or a democratic transition, will send shockwaves through these proxy networks. If a democratic government were to emerge, one of the first things they would likely do is cut funding to foreign militias to focus on rebuilding the domestic economy. That would completely rewrite the security architecture of the Middle East.
It is fascinating to think about. A democratic Iran could actually lead to a more stable Middle East because the ideological drive to export the Islamic Revolution would disappear. But getting from here to there seems like walking through a minefield. The international community seems divided on how to handle this. The US and Europe are often out of sync, and now we have Russia and China deepening their ties with Tehran. Iran is supplying drones for the war in Ukraine, and in return, they are getting advanced military technology and diplomatic cover at the UN. It feels like Iran is no longer just a regional challenge, but a key player in a new global alignment.
That is a critical point. Iran has successfully integrated itself into what we might call the axis of evasion. By aligning closely with Moscow and Beijing, they have insulated themselves from Western pressure. This global polarization makes a new nuclear deal almost impossible. Why would Iran make concessions to Washington when they can sell oil to Beijing and exchange military tech with Moscow? The geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically since 2015. The West can no longer dictate the terms of engagement the way it used to.
So, if the old tools of diplomacy and sanctions are no longer working, what is the path forward? We are looking at a regime that is highly resilient, globally connected, yet domestically fragile. It is a dangerous combination. If you are a policymaker in Washington or Brussels, how do you support the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people without triggering a devastating regional war or pushing Iran to build a nuclear bomb?
It requires a fundamental shift in perspective. For too long, Western policy has been hyper-focused on the nuclear issue to the exclusion of everything else. We need a holistic approach that connects the nuclear file with human rights and regional aggression. Instead of focusing solely on what is happening inside the nuclear facilities at Natanz, we need to focus on supporting the civil society inside Iran. This means providing tools to bypass government internet shutdowns, targeting the assets of human rights abusers abroad, and making it clear that any future economic integration is tied to domestic reforms. We must stop treating the regime as a permanent fixture and start planning for the day after.
That day after is perhaps the most critical part of this entire discussion. The future of Iran is not just a security challenge to be managed. it is an opportunity. A democratic Iran, home to one of the youngest, most educated populations in the region, could become a major engine for economic growth and cultural exchange. But the transition will be perilous, and the cost of miscalculation is incredibly high. As we look at the chessboard today, the moves we make or fail to make will shape the global order for decades to come. The question is whether the international community has the vision and the patience to play the long game, or if we will remain trapped in a cycle of short-term crisis management. Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Sentinel. We leave you today with this thought. In a world of complex geopolitics, the most powerful force for change is often the quiet determination of people who refuse to lose hope. Stay informed, see clearly, and we will see you next time.